Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you my new Spanish repertoire. It's going to be a full Spanish repertoire covering everything from the closed Spanish and every important closed Spanish variation, the open Spanish, the Berlin, the Archangel, the martial attack, and all the sidelines on move 3 and move 4. So it's going to be a complete Spanish repertoire. You might get a headache at some point because there's a lot of stuff we have to go through, but there is no avoiding theory if you're going to play the Spanish. Now the upside is the Spanish is by far the best response to e5, and it's played by every strong player. The Spanish repertoire is available on Nocti. If you don't know what Nocti is, it's basically a sparring partner if you don't have a human who is willing to play chess against you constantly. I use it to prepare my opening lines, and the thing I use most are themes, so you can play out any position you want, an opening position, endgame position, anything against Nocti. It's going to give you immediate feedback, and it's going to try to trick you and fight you just like a real human would. So let's say you want to prepare for a game against a 2000 FIDE rated guy, set Nocti to that difficulty and play. What you can also do is you can import repertoires. So as you can see, I have a bunch here, among them the new Spanish repertoire for white. So I've imported it here, and practicing the repertoire against Nocti is going to be infinitely more effective than trying to learn theory. So what you can do, you can play games against Nocti in that opening, select the time format, select the side, and play. Nocti is going to play within the repertoire. Once you exit theory, it's going to play on its own, basically. Okay, it plays the fianchetto. So immediately, I mean, you haven't seen the video yet, but this is very rare. And it's going to play a bunch of different stuff if you play many, many games. So visit Nocti following the description below. Use the code Hanging Pawns if you decide to go premium and unlock all the features. It's a great tool I constantly use. The Spanish repertoire is also available in the shop on my Patreon page, so if you would like to get it that way, follow the link in the description. Download the repertoire. It costs $3 US, and there are a bunch of other repertoires in the shop and way more coming up. Alternatively, you can decide to become a member on Patreon for just $3 a month, and you will gain access to all the repertoires you can see here, as well as about 500 other posts, videos, and much more. Now let's get into Spanish theory. Now, this video is intended for tournament players, those who wish to have a very solid full repertoire in e4, e5. It may not be suitable for beginners. And I'm also not going to be explaining a lot of beginner themes. If you would like to see that, watch my introductory video to the Spanish, and you will get a beginner-friendly intro there, and then you can move on to this. So before we go into any theory, I would like to say that I am going to try to focus on ideas instead of theory. So if you find yourself in a Spanish you don't know, or if you're out of book, you will still know how to navigate these positions. We're going to be looking at, well, everything that's important. If you don't know what's important, I'll make a short division first. So the Spanish begins with bishop b5, and black chooses between a6, knight f6, and many sidelines as we're going to see. Knight f6, the Berlin, is a completely separate animal. It doesn't have anything to do with the Spanish, in my opinion. We're going to cover that separately. a6 can still be many different openings. White plays bishop a4. If black continues knight f6, which is the main move, white castles. Now black has a choice. Black can play knight takes e4, which is the open Spanish, and this is the most forcing of all Ruy Lopez lines. You will have to know about 15 moves of theory, and there is no avoiding that. It's very, very forced. Then the alternative, once again to the main lines, is going into the Muller or the Archangel, with bishop b3, bishop b7, which is the Archangel, and bishop c5, which is the Muller. Now we are going to cover those separately as well. And finally, against castles, black can play the move bishop e7, which is the main line. And now after rook e1, b5, bishop to b3, black again has a choice. They can play d6, and then we head into closed Spanish lines. So d6 threatening knight a5, c3 creating a square for the bishop, running away from knight a5, preparing to defend the e-pawn, and so on, and preparing d4, of course. And after castles, h3, now we have reached the beginning of the closed Spanish, where black has many different moves. We are going to cover knight a5, the Chigorin, knight b8, the Breyer, we're going to cover h6, rook e8, and everything of importance. And the alternative to going into the closed Spanish is delaying d6 and castling first, inviting the martial attack. And if you want to play an anti-martial, then this part of the repertoire is not for you. Skip to the next part. But we are going to allow the martial because I have something very interesting prepared. So we play c3, and again, black can play d6, transposing to the closed Spanish, but I can also play d5, the martial attack. So that's going to be the focus of this video, and once again we are going to cover every sensible alternative on move 3 and move 4 for black. For, well, those players who like to avoid theory are going to play one of those. So let's start. I would like to begin with the martial attack, actually, because there has been a lot of debate lately, by lately I mean the last 20 years, about the opening, and more top grandmasters avoid it nowadays, but I have found a very interesting line, which I'm going to play myself in tournament games, and I'm going to allow it, so I'm going to show you that line. So after bishop to e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, again d6 would lead to the closed Spanish positions, but if they castle, we allow the martial attack. They play d5. Now, if you don't know the story about this, Frank Marshall has been preparing this pawn gambit for about 10 years. And when he finally got to play it against Capablanca in a game, he lost the game. So that doesn't mean that the opening is bad. The martial attack is a very interesting opening, but you still have to be careful. Now, the following 4 moves are, well, 6 moves actually are forced. So this you just have to learn. You win a pawn. e5, knight d5, knight e5. We won the e-pawn, but black's going to get a ton of initiative in exchange for that. Knight takes, rook takes. Now you have to defend the knight. You don't want to go bishop d6 straight away because you lose the knight, so c6. d4, although there are alternatives. Bishop d6, the rook is attacked. The rook drops to e1. Black plays queen h4, threatening to take on h2. We play g3, and black plays queen h3. This is the beginning of theory. This is move 14. If you go into the martial, you have to play the first 14 moves a tempo, and you need to have an hour and 35 minutes on your clock if you're playing a classical tournament. You just have to, because it's all forcing. Now, in this position, white has many moves, about 7 sensible moves. People most commonly play bishop e3, but we're going to play the move rook e4. And rook e4 is a very aggressive move, first of all, but it's also prophylactic, because we're preparing 2 things. The first thing is rook h4, dislodging the queen and putting pressure on h7. But secondly, and probably more importantly, we want to go queen f1. And when we go queen f1, we are forcing the queen out of the danger zone for our king and basically consolidating. The downside of rook e4 is that we aren't developing. One other downside that may not be apparent now is that in many cases we will be sacrificing the exchange. You will see why. Now, I should say that g5 is the only move for black. g5 just has to be played. If, I don't know, let me see, if a random move like a5, okay, a5 we can actually go a4 because the bishop's trapped. Let's say, I don't know, bishop to b7. Then we go rook h4, the queen must move away. Once the queen moves away, we just continue developing, we have evicted the queen, and everything is great. So black plays g5. Now you may be wondering, well, why don't we take that pawn? If you play bishop takes g5, this is the losing move because it's just a double attack. And the bishop's hanging, the rook is hanging, you cannot take that pawn. So on g5, we don't take the pawn. Black has prevented rook h4. We go queen f1. And of course, black doesn't trade queens. If black trades queens, then we're just up a pawn for nothing. And also this pawn is hanging. So they go queen h5. They don't want to go queen h6 because that may run into h4 and the pin with the bishop. If they take, which is a sensible move according to the engine, but I think not what many people would play, we are fine. We take with the king, they go bishop f5, we drop the rook back, they go rook e8, and now we have a problem. We don't really want to allow rook takes e8. So let's say we take on g5. If we take on g5, this is mate in 2. So, sorry, bishop h3 and king g1 and rook takes. So that's out of the question. How do we defend mate? Well, we have to prevent rook takes, and we don't want to allow rook takes back, and then once again, same idea, bishop h3, and instead of taking the rook, they just go rook e1 mate. So we have to defend. So we play bishop e3. And we are preventing any action down the e file. And if they go bishop d3 now, which is the best move, king g1, f5, threatening to, advance and force the bishop back and so on, we play the move rook d1. So when they exchange on f1, in my opinion, it's trickier to play for white than when they move the queen back, but only if black knows the exact lines that cause white problems. So we're going to have a very knowledgeable opponent for them to justify queen takes f1. Okay, so the bishop must move. Bishop e2. Okay, rook e1, we attack. Bishop d3. We don't repeat now, we can go bishop d2. This is suboptimal according to the engine, but according to the engine, you go rook d1. Bishop d2 is slightly worse. And now after rook e1, bishop e1, rook e8, we can now go knight d2, and everything is safe. We're up a pawn, the engine says white is plus 0.4, and so on. So there are some tricky lines after queen f1. You have to know them, but once you do, you're going to be fine. So we just looked at queen takes queen. Most people, though, 90% of people are going to go queen h5, I think. Now, we continue developing. We don't really have time to move the bishop to, well, anywhere. If we go bishop e3, then f5, and our rook is gone. If we go bishop d2, then where do we move the knight? Once again, f5, the rook must move somewhere to e1, let's say, and then f4, and we're in trouble. So instead of that, we just go knight d2. And there are many moves for black here. The very tempting bishop h3 isn't really a big deal because we have queen e2, and after something like queen g6 and threatening bishop f5, we don't really have to worry. If they go bishop f5, we can go knight e5. So that's fine. So bishop h3 isn't really a big deal. I'm more concerned about f5 and bishop f5. If they go f5 straight away, this is a resource you have to remember. Gain this tempo on the queen as soon as you can. You don't really care about this knight. You're never going to take that knight. So bishop d1, and the bishop can eventually come back to cover the light squares. Queen h6, rook e1, we have to save the rook, and f4. As soon as f4 is played, knight e4, knight c5 becomes an option, and it's easier to defend. So against f5, I like the idea of dropping the bishop back, and then if they go f4, I go knight e4. If they don't go f4, well, where's the attack? Maybe rook a7, rook f7 is an option, but that's not as scary. If they go rook a7, we can probably just continue with c4 and start undermining this structure. But the most promising move for black, in my opinion, is bishop f5. And now we take a very radical approach to this position. We play the move f3. Sacking the exchange. Now, if they take, white is much better. And if knight f6, then we just, no, not even e5, we just take the knight, excuse me. So the knight must move back somewhere else. The best move is knight b6, and now we go e5. And once the bishop is saved, you can, I hope you can see how crushing this is. This is just huge. Weakness, weakness. The knight's going to move away to e4, come here. The bishop develops, the rook comes to f1. This is, I think for humans, this is close to losing for black. The engine only says +1. So after f3, black, of course, does not take. They play rook e8. And what I like to do here, even though it's not the best move according to the engine plays a4, I like to take. And just, you know, I'm not sacking the exchange anymore. And then I go knight e4, give a pawn back. If they don't take, they have to waste the tempo moving the bishop. So takes, rook takes, and now just bishop d1. I have the bishop pair. My king is safe because black has lost their attacking power. And after something, whoa, like g4, I just go bishop d2, I continue developing. This bishop could come to c2, and I like my position. So this is what we do in the Marshall. On queen h3, we go rook e4. This is the move. Okay, now let's move on to the Archangel. In the Archangel, after castles, black immediately plays b5. And when we go bishop b3, black goes bishop to b7. Now, as opposed to the Marshall, the Archangel is not as forcing. So on anything below serious tournament level, black might deviate due to their ignorance, but you, if you know the ideas, are going to be fine even if they do. So I'll try to explain the ideas. So first we go rook e1. Now at every single point there are alternatives for white, but I'm just showing you a straight line you're going to follow until a position that becomes familiar, that you can navigate even if black deviates. So bishop c5, c3. Now the idea behind c3 is to defend the e4 pawn, to avoid knight a5, to be able to retreat the bishop, and to eventually play d4, d5. So we are going to approach the Archangel as if we were playing a normal closed Spanish. d6, d4, fine, bishop b6. And now we are going to play bishop e3, which is one of the main moves, and we are not hanging the e-pawn. This does not hang the e-pawn, because if they take, we can now go d5, and it's a double attack on two knights. So we are threatening bishop takes if the knight moves, and then taking the knight on e4. So on bishop e3, knight e4 loses a piece. Most people are going to castle, although ed is an option, but it's not scary. ed, cd, knight a5, bishop c2 castles, knight bd2, knight f1, g3, so on. Easy to play against. Most people are going to castle, and now we're going to play d5. This is the point of our setup. We can get away with d5 because bishop e3 is not a playable move. Why? Because all the pieces are lined up along this diagonal, and if bishop e3, we can simply take on c6 and two pieces are hanging. This doesn't work. So on d5, the knight must move away, and now we exchange on b6, and after c takes b6, we have this bad bishop to play against. This piece is going to be very hard to bring back into play without playing bishop c8, but even so, we can always play h3. We have to cover the f4 square. That's something we have to be careful about. Other than that, white has a pretty significant static advantage. So that's what we play for in the Archangel. Now, moving on to the open Spanish. This is going to be very hard for people who have never played the Spanish before. There is simply no alternative to learning a ton of theory here. I'm sorry, but there isn't. And there isn't even that many things you can use as strategic ideas that will help you make your decisions. It's just very forcing lines. So after a6, bishop a4, knight f6 castles, we know that the normal Spanish lines we have just looked at go bishop e7 and so on, or b5 going into the Archangel or the Muller. But in the open Spanish, black takes on e4. And when black takes on e4, they are introducing a very dynamic element, and there's a reason this is called the open Spanish as opposed to the closed Spanish. We're going to have a look at it in a second. These positions tend to be wildly complicated. So we play d4. We are putting pressure on the e-pawn, and black only has one sensible move. They gain a tempo back with b5, forcing our bishop to b3. And now black has a sideline with bishop e7, which I have never seen. There are 7,000 games with d5, which is the best move. and there are a few games with bishop e7, so the move doesn't really make sense. So black plays d5, and we want to take the pawn on e5. I should just say that if black is careless and they try to, hold on to their pawn with e takes d4, white should have a significant advantage with rook e1, and you have to defend. But now we play c3, and after c3, if this knight is taken, we are just winning after bishop d5. Two knights are hanging, and white is winning. So ed4 really isn't a good move. Everyone's going to go d5. If they play the open Spanish, they know d5. They know everything. So we continue. D takes e5, win the pawn back, bishop e6, the only good move, and knight bd2. There are many alternatives here. If you don't like my suggestions, I would recommend trying out queen e2. That's an alternative I like, but I still prefer knight bd2. Now, black can play bishop e7 in this position, black can play bishop c5, those are minor sidelines, but most people are going to play knight c5, because knight c5 avoids complications with knight e4, puts pressure on the b3 bishop. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to expand with c3 to prevent an easy d4 and to limit the knight on c6. So we play c3. Now black really should castle and play bishop e7 and castle, but there are many moves here. By far the most aggressive is d4 straight away. Why is it so aggressive? Well, because you allow bishop takes e6, knight takes e6, and c takes d4. And after knight c takes d4, it's very risky to have your king in the center while everything is opening up, and especially since white has the move knight e4. And you can see that even jumps with knight f6 could be dangerous. So finally bishop e7, bishop e3, the knight needs to move, so knight f5, and now queen c2. You cannot take on e3. If you take on e3, you lose. Knight e3, there's queen c6, and you either move your king or you play queen d7 and lose the rook. So knight e3 is just a bad move, so black needs to castle first. And now we throw in a tempo rook a d1. Now white can take. Takes, queen c8, something like knight d4. And white has, I think, a nice initiative with two rooks down the two open files. And this e5 pawn, even though it's a doubled pawn, provides a lot of attacking chances for white. So that's d4. I think it's the most aggressive move, but white shouldn't really struggle against it at all. The other alternative to the main line with bishop e7, just developing, is bishop g4. Now, I'm not a big fan of bishop g4 because we can now play bishop to c2, permanently saving our bishop, and when they continue developing, we just go to e1, and then we go knight b3. And knight b3 is a nice move. Firstly, we want to go knight d4 in many cases, so black's going to go bishop e6. And once we set up this blockade, not now, eventually, we might be able to get a very secure position where even the f5 square could be a problem for black, and we may just win the bishop pair, the bishop on e7. So firstly, we unpin queen d3. g6, we were also coincidentally threatening mate. And now bishop h6, another tempo, rook e8, and now queen e3. And after queen e3, we are preventing knight c5 and bishop c5. We can continue with knight d4, but more importantly, we can also continue with h3 and basically force black to give up the bishop on f3. So I think bishop g4 isn't really such a good move. Again, most people will play bishop e7 and continue by just castling. So bishop c2, d4. Now we are transposing to the d4 lines after all the trades, but our bishop is not on b3 anymore. We have played bishop c2, so now we don't have the option to play bishop takes e6. Instead, we play knight b3 straight away. And this is the beginning of the forced line. Now, this is move 12. You have to know the next 10 moves. So about move 22 is where you can start to relax. And I'm sorry, there is no alternative to knowing all of this. Black plays d3. We have to save the bishop. Black takes on b3. We take back. Black plays bishop f5. and we play rook e1. Okay, castles, b4. There are alternatives to b4, but I like the idea of b4 because we plan to play bishop a2 in many positions, if allowed, and once again activate our bishop, and we are also playing against a5, so basically forcing black to play a5 before moving the rook or the knight. Also moving the rook loses a pawn. We're just fixing 2 pawns with 1 pawn, so it's a useful move, and it also gives our bishop a square. So queen d7, h3, rook fd8, bishop a2, and black really should go bishop e6 here. This is the first deviation. Most people don't play bishop a2. And I'm expecting most people with black to play bishop e6. If they do, we go back. If they don't, then we just have a nice bishop on a very aggressive diagonal and, you know, in some cases threatening knight g5 or bishop f7. So bishop e6, we go back. They can go g6, they don't have to. Bishop h6, if they do. And at this point, you can just play chess. But I think the first 20 moves, you just have to know. And I'm sorry. So the Open Spanish is going to be a painful experience. If you already have a headache at this point, trust me, we have a long way to go, but I'll try to make this as easy to understand as possible. Go have, you know, I'm having coffee, have something that relaxes you, have some beer. We are moving on to the Berlin. The reason I'm showing you the Berlin and the Open Spanish one after the other is because they have a lot in common, even though they are completely different types of positions. In my opinion, the Open Spanish and the Berlin defense are the only two openings within the Spanish, within the Ruy Lopez, where white is forced into black's comfort zone. And there is no way to get... There is no alternative. You cannot avoid it. So knight f6, the Berlin. Black does not play a6. Black just, you know, continues developing. And if you've seen my only tournament game in the Berlin where I had white, I played d3, the anti-Berlin, but I no longer do that. I chose to castle, and black has two moves here. As we're going to see, one of them is bishop c5, which transposes to the classical variation of the Spanish. It's okay, I mean, it's nothing major. This is called the Beverwijk variation, or however that's pronounced. There are many ways to play against this, but I prefer the simple knight e5 and d4 plan. So knight e5, d4, getting your piece back. Now, black should play c6 or a6. If they just move one of the pieces, white's better. I think c6 is the better move, but a6 is slightly more popular, so it's fine. d5, knight e4, and bishop d3, and this is, you know, white has a slight edge, in my opinion. If they go a6, then we drop the bishop back to e2, they take on e4, we take on c5, and now after d6, which is one of the main moves, there's this forcing line with queen d4, knight takes, and f4, and once the knight drops back, we take on g7. Now this is supposed to be 0.6 for white. It's a pretty big advantage, especially if black doesn't play precisely. Black has a series of basically only moves here, so I don't really think bishop c5 is challenging if you play knight e4 and d4, so, you know, not a problem. Most people are going to go knight e4, inviting the endgame. We are not going to go into the endgame. We are going to go into, I don't know what to call it. I like to call it the Petrov structure, where we have the one open file, the e file. So we're going to go rook e1. This is one of the more popular moves, but it doesn't trade queens, and it keeps the position a bit more interesting. So the knight needs to move. d5 and f5 are not good. I hope you know that. If d5, then d3, and just, you know, everything's dropping. And if f5, then d3, and everything's dropping. You can also throw in bishop c6. So instead of that, the knight must move back. So knight d6. And of course, in this position, the pawn is hanging. Whether we exchange the knight or not, we're not exchanging the knight. We play knight e5. And of course, we are now threatening knight c6, winning the game, winning the queen, winning everything. It's possible to play knight e5, rook e5, bishop e7, bishop f1. This is fine. We're just going to go into the same variation. But the more popular way to continue is after knight d6, knight e5 to go bishop e7 straight away. So don't be confused if they take on e5. That's fine. Now we have to save the bishop. So bishop f1, because knight c6 is no longer check. Knight e5, rook e5, castles. This part is forcing. d4, bishop f6, rook e1, rook e8, c3, rook e1, queen e1. And this is where the game begins. Now, why have I chosen this against the Berlin? There is one simple reason. We have an improved Petrov. Why is this an improved Petrov? Well, Black could play d5, and they should play d5. I think that's the best positional decision they could make. So most people are going to go knight e8 and d5. That makes sense. They don't have to, though. I've had people play b6 and bishop b7 against me. In any case, since this knight is not on f6, h7 is kind of tender. If we manage to occupy this diagonal and the knight comes to g3 and we look at f5 and h5 with the knight, we have great attacking prospects. Also, the queen has an easy way into the position, any of these squares. So even though the position is obviously equal, and it's symmetrical, I think if anyone's going to have attacking pressure, it's going to be white. So knight e8, again, is the most common move. Bishop f4, developing the bishop, and d5. Instead of bishop f4, there's an interesting line with d5, which just prevents d5. But I think it's kind of risky. If you want a very imbalanced game, then by all means go d5. It's interesting, I don't like it, so I'm going to delete this. So bishop f4 allowing d5, knight d2, bishop f5, queen e3. You can also play bishop d3 first, that's fine. Okay, queen e3, knight d6, rook e1. Okay. I like playing without bishop d3. I like playing queen e3 because I'm in a great hurry to occupy the e file, because if black at any point plays rook e8 or queen e8, if we take, the knight's gonna end up on e8. So the knight's gonna be completely misplaced. In fact, after queen d7, queen f3, rook e8 takes and takes. Of course, if you take with the queen, I can take on d5. That was the point behind queen f3. And you get a kind of position like this where, of course, it's equal. And this is with perfect play from black and from white. It's plus 0.2. Again, I slightly prefer white. Technically, any high-level game from here should end in a draw, but any Berlin endgame should end in a draw too. So you're choosing between two kind of passive ways to play, but there is no alternative. Now, we're finally moving to the closed Spanish. So, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, the bishop drops back, knight f6, castles, none of the sidelines anymore, so not knight e4, not b5. We follow the main lines. Rook e1, b5, bishop b3, no castling, not inviting the marshal, but d6, the main line stuff. Defending the pawn, threatening knight a5, so we have to play c3. Black castles. We go h3, preventing bishop g4. And now black has a choice. We are going to be looking at the Breyer, the Chigorin, the Flohr, the Zaitsev, the Smyslov, the Karpov, and the Kholmov. 7 most common ways to play this position. If you encounter something else, well, I'd be really surprised. And I'm saying in a tournament game against people rated more than 500. I'm going to explain them in order of frequency, starting with the most common move today, which is the Breyer. The Breyer is knight b8. Now you might be confused and think, well, what the hell is knight b8? Black wants to liberate the b-pawn and reroute the knight, in many cases, to d7 and put the bishop on b7. So the pawn's going to move, the bishop's going to have an open diagonal to e4, and, you know, black is claiming space in the center. Now, since black is playing this kind of passive move, we need to strike at the center straight away, so d4. Knight bd7, okay, knight bd2. We are going to go with the famous knight f1 g3 plan, bishop to b7. The pawn is under pressure, not yet falling, but we need to defend, because if we played knight f1 now, we would drop the pawn. So another purpose behind c3 is not only to prevent knight a5, but also to play bishop c2 and safeguard the pawn. Rook e8, and now we need to hurry, because if black plays bishop f8 and we go knight f1, they are once again winning the pawn, because they have the bishop, the knight, and the rook. So we need to go knight f1 and knight g3 to defend the e pawn. Okay, bishop f8, knight g3, forcing, we need to defend. Okay, now the game begins. And most people will, with black, are going to play g6 here. There are basically no alternatives. You could play c6 or a5, but against those moves, white doesn't really have to do anything, so g6. And the idea is, of course, to prevent knight f5, knight h5, and to give the bishop some options, either g6, g7, or h6. What I like to do here is I like to play a4. You can play many different things, but a4 is a very common plan to undermine this structure. Let me just use this opportunity to start introducing some relatively advanced positional ideas in the closed Spanish. This structure is going to be the basis of your understanding in the Spanish. And one of the most common things we have to know is that these two pawn breaks, f4, f5, are usually the way to create active play. Normally, playing f4 or f5 while the center is still fluid, by fluid I mean these pawns are here, the pawn hasn't advanced to d5, and black has the option to go c5 or d5 or c6 or take, white can take or go d5. While the center is fluid, you don't play f5 and f4. Black is basically playing a King's Indian. If you look at this, this is the King's Indian structure. But in the King's Indian structure, white's pawn is on d5. That's why black plays f5. Black doesn't play f5, the typical King's Indian pawn break, while white's pawn is still on c4. So unless the center closes down, f5 and f4 are very risky and almost always bad. If the bishop isn't on b7, and I'm not just referring to the Breyer, but every close Spanish line, a4 is much more promising because the rook's hanging, and it's basically a forcing move, because a4 with the rook undefended threatens ab, take the rook, win the game. The most important point, though, is when to close down the position with d5. Now, if we have a look at, let's say we play d5 here. It's not a good move. Don't do this. I just want to show you something. If you go d5 while black's c-pawn is free to move, then black can undermine your structure with c6. If we pretended that this was the King's Indian, white would have a pawn on c4. Notice how black has a pawn on b5, making c4 impossible? Yep. So if c6, we don't have c4. If we had c4, d5 would be a good move. Since we don't have c4, d5 is a terrible move. So remember not to play d5 if black has a pawn on c7 and can undermine d5 and you don't have c4. Hypothetically, if you played a4 and black took, then d5 would be a good move, because on c6 we could play c4 and we would still be able to maintain the center. That's just a bit of positional introduction to the closed Spanish. So we play a4 here. And black, of course, doesn't take. The rook's defended, so black isn't forced to take. Black plays c5. When black plays c5, this is a completely different story. The pawn on d5 can no longer be undermined with c6, so we play d5. Now our center is secure. Now we have a weird King's Indian / Spanish hybrid, where white has a secure center, and we can now both switch plans to these pawn breaks. Once the center closes down, it's much easier to play on the flanks. Okay, now what's the idea behind knight b8, knight d7? Well, the idea is to give the knight the c5 square. So black plays c4 and wants to play knight c5. Now I'm going to recommend the radical approach here. Everyone plays bishop g5 here. The alternative is knight h2 playing for an early f4. I will recommend the move bishop e3. And after knight c5, even the people who play bishop e3 don't do what you're about to see now. We are going to take on c5. The reason most people play bishop e3 is because they want to go queen d2, exchange these bishops and start an attack. We're not going to do that. We're taking on c5. And after dc5, now we're playing queen d2. We want to come into the dark squares and we want to prevent bishop h6, but we have created a passed pawn. And after, I don't know, knight d7, for example, we now go h4. And if h5 isn't prevented, we have a passed pawn here. We're playing against a bad bishop, and we also have ideas of infiltrating with the rook on the third rank. So black basically has to play h5. But that gives away the g5 square. And first of all, rook ad1, create support for the pawn so that if the opportunity arises, we can go d6 and have the pawn defended, and then continue with an attack. I love this idea. So our strategic idea against the Breyer, and I know that may sound radical, is we wait for c5, then we play d5. Then black does his stuff, gets the knight to c5, but we play bishop e3 before that happens, and after knight e5 we immediately take. Okay, now there are alternatives for black. Black can play queen c7 here. So we go queen d2. And if they go knight c5 now I don't recommend taking, because, you know, black can take with the queen, so it's just not as good. What I would recommend here is knight h2. And after ba4, we ignore that pawn, we can win it later. We now go bishop g5, put pressure on the knight, bishop g7, and now queen e2, putting pressure on c2 and preparing h4, h5. So we switch plans. Of course, we don't take on c5 when there's a queen on c7. So that's the Breyer. Now, the Chigorin. The Chigorin is probably the most popular of all the closed Spanish lines. So not knight b8, but knight a5. And knight a5 has a similar idea in mind to the Breyer. Black is trying to free up the c-pawn, but in this case they are doing it with tempo on the bishop. We of course have to save the bishop. Black plays c5, and of course we go d4. Now remember, the pawn is on c5, so if allowed, we are of course going to go d5. Queen c7, d5. This is the beginning of theory. The only alternative to queen c7 is knight d7, but against this we also go d5. And black's idea is to double control c4, but b3, and also to free up the f-pawn, so f5. And I really don't think this is a big deal. So d4, queen c7, d5. Knight c4, black's idea. Okay, we have to chase that knight away. In my opinion, you can play a4, knight bd2 or queen e2, but I love the move b3. I just want to get rid of that knight. The knight drops to b6, and we go bishop e3. White's plan long term, as I said, is going to be to blast open the king side with f4. If the center is closed, you can consider moves like a4 and get some action down the a file, or you can play f4. Long term, I like playing for f4. This is the setup I like for white. Black has many options here, but c4 is the most promising one. And now white has a lot of moves. And one of the most common moves is knight a3. I would recommend that you don't go for that. I would recommend the normal knight bd2 and just, you know, get on with your life. I don't know what black does, probably bishop d7. Now rook c1, just preventing any takes, and so on and so on. I think the Chigorin really isn't a problematic opening to play against, because this is the famous Chigorin problematic knight. And black is gonna be struggling with that piece for the rest of the game. The Flohr. Now, the Flohr is the third most common closed Spanish line, and it's a hybrid between the closed Spanish and the Archangel, in my opinion. We played h3, preventing bishop g4, so black says, okay, I'll play bishop b7. Why did you play h3? Now, the strategic consequence of h3 is pretty significant, and if you think about it, this knight coming to f4 would be disastrous, and when you play h3, g3 is much harder to play because the h3 pawn's hanging. So h3 bishop b7 is actually a smart idea. So when I was preparing the Spanish for black, I actually wanted to play the Flohr system. Okay, so we do pretty much the same thing we do in the Archangel. We just go d4 and, get on with our lives. The pawn is on c7, so not d5. We don't play d5, we continue. Bishop f8, the pawn isn't hanging yet because the knight is on c6, so we don't have to play bishop c2 just yet. Instead, I will recommend a weird line with a3, b4, bishop b2. I know that sounds strange, and I know that most people are used to having the queen's bishop on c1 for a long time in the Spanish, but I'll actually recommend a weird setup that goes like this. Bishop c2, knight b8, knight d7 is one of the most common plans. b4, knight bd7, and bishop b2. I know that this looks strange, but look at the bishop. Look at c5. It cannot be played so easily. We always have c4. And I think these two bishops working together could bring a lot of attacking prospects later on in the game. And also the knight coming to f5 and maybe the queen infiltrating. For the moment, we still have to be careful about knight f1 because, of course, the e-pawn is hanging. But I like this idea. It's a radical idea. Not many people play it. There are about 300 games from here. So it's not unknown, but it's pretty rare. Okay, the Zaitsev. So after h3, the Zaitsev is on the highest level usually an invitation to a draw. And the famous draw in the Zaitsev is knight g5, and you repeat, and that's it. Rook e8, basically, after knight g5, you have to move the rook back. Okay, so you have to play rook f8. We're not going to do that. We're going to go d4 and approach this the same way we approach the Flohr with bishop b7. And we are actually going to transpose in many, many cases. So black's main move here is bishop b7. They don't have to play it straight away. They can go bishop f8 or play different moves, but eventually they will play this. So this is, the Flohr and the Zaitsev are the same thing. We are just transposing. They just play rook e8 before bishop b7. So don't even waste time differentiating between the two. Okay, Smyslov. The Smyslov is what they used to play before the Zaitsev. So before rook e8 was introduced, they used to play h6, preventing knight g5 so that they are able to play rook e8. Today, the Smyslov is considered outdated and unnecessary. And technically, it is a waste of tempo compared to the other closed Spanish lines. Slow move, we go d4. Rook e8, so it's the same thing. It's just that black is down a tempo. We would have played the same thing anyway. We wouldn't have played knight g5. So in our case, h6 is a very welcome insertion. Knight bd2, bishop f8, knight f1, bishop d7. Now bishop d7 isn't forced. They can also go bishop b7, but we just do the same thing. Knight g3, knight a5, bishop c2. Very, very standard position where we are up a tempo compared to the normal lines because h6 has been played. And remember what I said about h3. If the knight ever lands on f5, g6 can no longer be played because we just take on h6. So that's another reason why h6 really isn't a great move. Now, knight c4 is what most people play. We just chase that knight away. The knight goes to b6, and now I like a4, but you can also play bishop d2 or bishop b2. From here, I don't think you should listen to anyone's advice. If you have any experience in the Spanish, just play whatever's most comfortable for you. I would go a4 here because I like disrupting the king side. Now, Karpov and Kholmov. Firstly, the Karpov. The Karpov, funnily enough, if the Karpov in the Caro-Kann is knight d7 like this, the Karpov in the Spanish is knight d7 like this. Now, this is a strange move. However, knight d7 has a very specific purpose in mind. Black wants to free up the c-pawn in some cases and give this knight the e7 square. So in order to do that, black moves the knight, moves the bishop into f6, and then moves this knight to e7. So black shuffles all the pieces in order to get the position they want. And, well, excuse me, and it's not bad. I mean, it's a normal opening. But again, a slow move, we play d4. Bishop f6. Now, we don't really want to bring this bishop to life. So even though the pawn is still on c7, we play d5. Okay, and the knight, as I said, goes to e7. And the rook isn't defended, so we know what to do. We go a4, we're threatening to win a pawn. Black must defend, bishop b7. AB, rook takes, bishop takes, knight a3. Now, the reason I like this for white is because this is what I call the dead Spanish bishop for black. When this happens, c6 is the only thing black needs to think of. But for a moment, b5 is also a problem. So after something like knight c5, getting a tempo on the bishop, now you don't really have knight takes b5 because of queen b8 and there are two pieces attacked, although you could have. But in any case, we save the bishop. c6 saving the pawn, b4 chasing the knight away, and dc, bishop c. Now, b5 is weak, and we can simply put pressure on the pawn. We can play bishop d3, queen e2, or queen d3, which I think is better, because after queen d3 we have rook d1. And I think the Karpov variation is completely unlike Anatoly Karpov. He, by the way, used to play the Zaitsev a lot, so he didn't play the Karpov that much. I think this is just good for white. Weakness, d5 has to be played, then e5 is weak. Not that white is winning or anything, but if you turn on the engine, it's plus 0.7, which is huge in the close Spanish. Now, the Kholmov. The final move we're going to look at, the final variation of the close Spanish, is bishop e6. Now, we are going to take this. If you look at the book, almost no one takes. Most people play d4. I don't like d4. I think taking gives white a static advantage, and taking suits my style. If you like dynamic positions, don't take. I like having a static advantage. What do I mean by that? We take, they take, and now we go d4. Now, of course, if black exchanges on d4 now, e takes d4, c takes d4, I mean, we have these two moves. I don't think this is that good. Let's say queen d7. We don't have to do anything radical yet. We can just go knight c3, and we simply have more space in the center. So this is just visually better for white, and we have more space, we are better. So most people aren't going to do that. It's not a decisive advantage, the engine says plus 0.7. So most people, after fe6, d4, aren't going to take. They're going to do something like, I don't know, queen d7. Let's say queen d7. And now we take. Takes, knight takes, pawn takes. This is what I want. Now, every time this position has been reached in the past, people will take on d7. Taking on d7 is a mistake. The reason taking on d7 is a mistake is because you allow this knight to transfer to c5 and put pressure on the e4 pawn while activating the rook. We don't want to do that. So we go knight d2, defending the pawn, and we're going to go queen c2 and then move the knight away. So let's say a5, queen c2, I don't know, a4, knight f3. This is what we're trying to get. This is what we're playing against the Kholmov. And I think if you get this, I mean, who would take black here? It's nothing major. If you turn on the engine, it's plus 0.2, so it's almost completely equal. Sorry, someone keeps messaging me. Let me turn off my phone. Okay. Sorry about that, I forgot. What? Okay, maybe, I don't know. I hope they stop. Maybe I didn't press the vibrate all the way to the end. In any case, bishop d6, for example, saving the pawn, bishop e3, rook f2, either rook a b8 or rook f b8, trying to play for b4. We're going to go rook c1 and play for c4. It seems like an equal position in which we have a slightly better structure. That's what I like. Okay, so far, we have looked at every single closed Spanish line. We have looked at the open Spanish, the Berlin, the Archangel, and the Marshall. All we have left are rare third and fourth move alternatives. So what happens, especially on lower levels, when black either has no idea what the closed Spanish is and they just make a random move here, or they know everything but they decide to deviate very early on. We are going to look at d6, knight d4, f5, bishop c5, g6, knight e7. We're going to look at all the weird defenses. Now I'll try to make this simple and give you a simple antidote against each. Firstly, let's start with the bird variation. Not the bird opening, the bird variation, knight d4. Named after the same guy though. When they play knight d4, that's very similar to some lines of the anti-Berlin with d3, where they go bishop c5 and knight d4. Now they are forced to take back with the pawn. So we take, we castle, they go bishop c5 in most cases, d3, c6, bishop a4, d6, for example. Our goal is to, of course, play f4, d6 and f4. And if black doesn't know what they are doing, they may go badly wrong here. This is a very easy attacking position for white with one downside. d5 or f5 disrupt our setup and break our center, in this case f5. And this is a very common way to punish e4, f4 structures in the Dutch, in the Grand Prix, in many other openings. If black plays passively, I don't know, knight f6 or knight e7 or bishop d7, then we simply continue the attack with knight d2, knight f3, and we keep pushing. We can also consider playing f5 straight away. So black should play f5 to disrupt our attack. And we go knight d2, they go knight f6, we go bishop b3. And black's going to have a hard time castling. Now, the only downside to moving the f-pawn and to taking on d4 is the e3 square. So you have to be slightly careful here. Black can go knight g4, and of course we don't want to lose the game, so, you know, knight e3 would be devastating, so we go rook e1. And since they go knight e3 anyway, at least now we're not hanging the exchange, we can firstly play ef, first idea behind rook e1, to pin the knight. And when they unpin, we can now go queen h5. This is what you have to know. If you know this, you're going to be winning a lot of games. If you turn on the engine, this is +1 for white. We have avoided all the tricks, and the bird variation does not work. Okay, let's continue. After the bird, let's look at the Cosio. This is slightly more normal. Now, the Cosio, we're going to castle, and black has g6 or knight g6. g6 transposes to the fianchetto defense, which we're going to have a look at in a second. So we're only going to consider knight g6, which is the proper Cosio. And it's a weird move. And it's not that good, in my opinion. We go d4. They should take because the pawn's hanging. So e takes d4, knight takes d4, and bishop c5. That's one of the main ideas. Now, against bishop c5, in the Cosio, there are several moves. Knight b3, bishop e3, and the most active move, knight f5. That's what we're going to do. We're attacking g7. Black must react. So castle's defending the pawn. And now I will recommend a very radical approach, bishop e3. This attacks the bishop. And why are we doing this? The knight on f5, once g7 has been defended, isn't really such a great piece. So we want to read out the knight to e3. And the reason I'm calling this radical is because we are going to continue with f4 later on, and we won't have the ability to play rook e1. So this is going to be a very strange position. So look at what happens. Bishop takes, knight takes. Let's say d6, that's just normal. f4, knight c7, and f5. So the knight comes to e5. We go knight c3. Black undermines our structure, undermines our pieces, chases the bishop back at f6. This is a very, very, very strange position, in my opinion. We have given away the e5 square. Instead of f6, black also could have gone queen to b6. That's not such a big deal. We have queen d2. The pawn cannot be taken. It's a strange position. So if you don't feel like doing this, don't play bishop e3 here. Play knight c3 and, you know, just have a normal game. You can also consider playing knight g3 and have something resembling the Spanish. But that's what I like to do against the Cosio. Moving on, let's look at the fianchetto defense. Against this weak castle, they go bishop g7, and the fianchetto defense, I think, is actually a great option for black, because in many Spanish lines, black aims for this King's Indian structure with d6, g6, but they do that by playing rook e8, sorry, bishop e7 castles, rook e8, bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. With the fianchetto defense, they just do that straight away. We go c3, I want to go d4, of course, a6, bishop a4, d6, d4, fine, bishop d7, and rook e1. And black has two moves here, knight g7 and knight f6. I will recommend different approaches. Against knight g7, I like the idea of playing d5 straight away. And once this knight moves away to a5, I like trading this and playing b3. So this way we're playing against this knight, we're playing against this bishop. Okay, but if they go knight f6, I actually prefer playing bishop c2 and just overprotecting this pawn and letting black decide what to do with the c pawn, with the f pawn, and just, I like to keep things flexible. h3, okay, we've talked about the f4 square. That could be a problem later on, but we're also playing against the bishop. Knight h5, bishop e3, let's say queen e8, knight bd2, king h8, black wants to play f5, we know that, a4, f5. Black playing f5 in such a fluid structure is riskier than in a structure where we have a pawn on d5, but it's okay. Still, we shouldn't be afraid of this. Why? We still have a pawn on d4. We take on e5. Now they should throw in f4. I think if they just take back, that's fine, but we can continue with something like a5. So let's say f4. Bishop d4, the only move that doesn't lose the bishop. d5, we have to save the bishop, so bishop c5. And now black has many options, rook f7, rook f6, I don't know. Let's say rook f6, that seems like a more promising move. Now we can play bishop b3, we can play b4. We basically have a choice. If we go b4, b6 doesn't work because of b5. If we don't go b4, then b6 doesn't work because of bishop a3. I prefer this for white. And the reason I prefer this for white is this pawn on e5. If you've ever played in the pawn of Caro-Kann as black, it's actually a pretty similar weakness. When in the pawn of Caro-Kann, white plays c4 and c5 and has this pawn on d4, of course with colors reversed, then black can easily target that pawn. So I've actually seen plans of bishop a3 and b4 and bishop b2 and c4 to just target the pawn on e5. And of course, black's compensation for that is in the form of g5. Okay, this could be scary, but it really shouldn't work. All right, let's continue with the Schliemann. If I had black in the Ruy Lopez, I would probably play this today. I just like it. And There are many ways for white to play against the Schliemann. I'm going to show you what I dislike for black the most. When I was preparing the Schliemann, I feared this move the most, d3. And black, of course, takes on e4, takes, and plays knight f6 and white castles. Now, the reason I don't like this for black is because if you play bishop c5, you're losing the e-pawn, and if you play d6, you're not losing the e-pawn, but your bishop is bad. So I think white is just better. Why does bishop c5 lose the e-pawn? Well, it's simple. We take on c6. And after, of course, dc6, queen d8, king d8, bah. So bc6. And now we just take on e5. It's as simple as that. If knight takes e4, queen h5 wins. So you cannot take the pawn back. So black has to castle. And now we just go knight c3, knight d3. Black has some initiative, but white is up a pawn. White is up a pawn. So after castles, black really should go d6, but then you have this bad bishop. So if you play this way as white, the Schliemann is really not that dangerous. Still, having said that, if I had black, I would still play the Schliemann, and in this position I would go d6. So bishop c4, knight a5, the bishop must move back. You don't want to leave the bishop on c4 because you're never castling. Something like this. Now the pawn on e5 is defended and black is fine. Black has the open f-file, semi-open f-file to work with, and maybe bishop g4. If you turn on the engine, it says white is better, but it's not such a big deal. Now let us move on from the Schliemann to the classical. As I said, this will most likely transpose to the Berlin if black ever plays knight f6. It's going to be the Beverwijk variation. So against this, we just castle and see whether black plays the Berlin or not. You know, if they go knight f6, this is now the Berlin. We know the drill, knight e5 and d4, they can go c6 and a6. We've seen this in the Berlin. The only alternative is knight d4, where, again, this is similar to the Berlin, the anti-Berlin with d3. They take with the bishop, but we haven't wasted the tempo on d3. So in the normal anti-Berlin, knight f6, d3 is played. In this case, our pawn is still on d2, so we can go c3 and d4 in one move. So this is a huge improvement to the anti-Berlin. So I really don't think this is such a huge deal. The only sideline worth mentioning is queen f6, but I mean, we go c3, they go knight e7, we go rook e1, they go a6, and we now go d4 straight away. The queen on f6 isn't that dangerously placed. The chances of you having this on the board are close to zero, but I still wanted to show it to you. And finally, let's have a look at d6, which is the Steinitz, and this is something you might actually encounter semi-frequently. It's just a very safe move, you know, defending the pawn. You're threatening to take on c6 and take on e5, so black just defends the pawn. The downside is, of course, d4, d5. So bishop d7, unpinning the knight. I like bishop takes c6. You may not like this approach, but I just think this is the best way to play in the Schliemann. Takes and knight c3. Now, why is this so nice in my opinion? Well, the e-pawn is hanging. So most people actually play f6 here. It's not that that's tactically losing, as is often the case with f6, but it's just, you know, it's an ugly move. The alternatives are f6 and taking on d4, but you need to deal with the pawn. If knight f6, it's just a counter-attack, so we defend queen d3. E d4, knight d4, attacking the bishop, bishop e7, f3, and from here on we're just going to play a sort of English attack. We're going to go bishop e3 and castles queenside. So I like this. And if they do go f6, we just go bishop e3 once again. Knight e7, queen e2, castles queenside. It's just perfect. Finally, let's look at fourth move alternatives. So after bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, black can still play the Schliemann. It's just called the deferred Schliemann. The ideas are the same, Black can also play d6, which is the modern Steinitz. Black can play bishop c5, which is the deferred classical. Black can play knight g7, which is the deferred Cosio, or g6. Black can play all of these options we just had a look at. So you can find them in the repertoire. I'm not going to go into details once more. However, there is a separate line that we need to look at, and that's b5. This is the Karpov variation, named after the guy who half semi-named the Karo Khan. So after b5, we play bishop b3, and Black's idea is to play knight a5 quickly, winning this bishop. In the normal lines where Black, plays d6 first and we play c3 and so on, Black doesn't get to take this bishop. But if Black delays or ignores kingside development completely, then they do win that bishop. However, it comes at a cost. We castle quickly, and now let's compare the development. Black's doing stuff, winning the bishop, we have already castled. So d6, d4, e4, knight d4. Now Black has a choice, either take on b3 or play bishop b7. If they go bishop b7, we go bishop d2 and force this trade. So most people are just going to take. ab3, the pawn's hanging, so bishop b7 defending, rook e1. And fine, we've lost the bishop pair, but Black needs to castle. Still. So bishop e7, knight c3, knight f6, knight f5. You can see that White may just have a crazy initiative in the future. You castle, let's say. We can go bishop g5. We can go queen f3. We may even consider queen d4. We may consider rook e3. I don't think many people would take Black here. We don't have our Spanish monster bishop, but we have other things going on. We have a knight on f5. So this is the only deviation on move 4 worth mentioning. Everything else is very similar to third move alternatives. I know that this video must have given you a headache. It was a long video. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. Get the repertoire on Nocti or on Patreon, and good luck with the Spanish. I'll see you in the next one. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.